On a warm June evening, a strange tension rippled through the air at my brother's graduation ceremony. I hadn't planned on attending. Being among throngs of people isn't my usual scene, but family duty prevailed. I remember standing among the crowd, lost in my thoughts, when I noticed him, the photographer. There's always someone behind the lens at these events, but this man's presence felt different. He wasn't weaving between groups, capturing families or graduates in triumphant embraces. He stood still, camera aimed only at me. The first thought, of course, was that he'd made a mistake. Maybe I had unknowingly stepped into someone else's picture. Yet, as the evening wore on, I caught his lens aimed at me again and again in every place I turned. It was disorienting, but I brushed it off, not wanting to come across as paranoid. But then he was there again, at my friend's party a few weeks later. The same stillness, the same unsettling focus on me. A sense of dread began to root itself in my chest. Icy tendrils winding around my heart. The final incident occurred at my mother's funeral. Of all places, of all moments, this was the one time I hoped I'd been mistaken. But no, as I stood by the casket, mourning, I saw him. His presence was so casual, almost intimate, as if he were a family friend snapping memories. I watched him, this stranger with a worn leather camera strap, moving silently through the shadows, capturing each movement, each tear-stained glance, each sorrowful sigh. The questions gnawed at my mind until I could no longer stand it. Gathering my courage, I approached him outside the funeral home. He was leaning against a post, his camera hanging from his neck, his face unreadable. As I drew near, he looked up, his expression shifting into something that almost resembled amusement. I demanded to know why he had been following me, why he had attended these events, only to photograph me alone. He smiled, a thin, ghostly smile, and without a word, he unclipped his camera, scrolling through the photos. My throat tightened. I saw images from my brother's graduation, the party, and my mother's funeral, each moment chronicled with eerie precision. He scrolled further, displaying pictures that went back years. Here I was as a child, playing on my front lawn, unaware of a camera lurking in the distance. Another, at a family holiday years ago. Every frame showed me, always captured at an unknowing angle, my life distilled into haunting fragments through the lens of this stranger. Then he stopped scrolling. The final picture flicked onto the screen. My breath caught in my throat, a tremor rattling through me. It was an image of me, taken just minutes before. My face, pale and confused, staring into his camera just moments before our confrontation. I stumbled back, the gravity of the realization crushing me. Before I could say anything, he tucked the camera back into his bag, gave a slight nod, and disappeared into the crowd, leaving me clutching my chest, my breath shallow. Even now, I feel him sometimes, though I never see him. I don't need to. Somewhere out there, someone is watching, waiting, each click of their shutter freezing moments of my life that I'll never see again, until the next time he chooses to reveal them. I didn't notice the odd gap in the floor plan until after we'd been in the house a few weeks. It was one of those little quirks you spot over time, like a light switch that doesn't do anything or a window that's a few inches too narrow. But there was something off about it, and the longer I lived in the house, the more it bothered me. It was a strange sort of emptiness, a section that seemed to exist on paper, but nowhere else. At first, I brushed it off. The house was old, after all, and maybe the space was part of some weird architectural choice, some bygone builder's eccentricity. But then came the whispers, faint, barely there, always drifting up when the house was silent. I'd be alone, sitting in the darkened living room, trying to unwind after a long day, and I'd hear it. At first, I told myself it was just the air moving through the old vents or some trick of the pipes. Yet something about those sounds didn't fit. They felt intentional. Words were indistinct, more like distant murmuring, an ongoing conversation too far away to make out, but close enough to make me uneasy. It was around 3 a.m. when I finally decided I'd had enough. Armed with a flashlight, I scanned the walls, looking for anything unusual. I tapped around, wrapping my knuckles along each wall, noting where the sound felt wrong, hollow. That's when I stumbled upon it, a hidden door concealed behind layers of drywall in the closet. My heartbeat quickened, thudding against my chest as if my own body was warning me to turn back, to shut the closet and forget I'd ever found anything. But curiosity got the better of me. With a few hesitant pushes, I peeled back the drywall enough to reveal an old wooden door. Its surface was pitted and scratched, worn by years of darkness. I gripped the handle, feeling the cold metal against my palm, and pulled. The door swung open slowly, groaning as if it hadn't been moved in years. Beyond lay a narrow staircase, steep and claustrophobic, descending into what looked like total darkness. The air was stale, thick with an old, musty scent, a smell of time and rot that had never seen daylight. My flashlight's beam cut through the dark, illuminating the path down. I hesitated on the threshold, acutely aware of how silent everything had become, as though the whole house was waiting, holding its breath along with me. Each step creaked as I moved down, my breath short and shallow. The walls were close, so tight that I had to turn slightly sideways to fit through. With every footfall, the air grew colder, denser, as if I were descending into the belly of something. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself standing before a small room, its walls lined with crude, childlike carvings. Tally marks, hundreds of them, scratched into every inch of the plaster, each stroke desperate and jagged, each one etched with a frantic energy that made my skin crawl. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the uneven grooves beneath my fingertips. Some were faded and worn, as though they'd been here for years. But others looked fresh, recently made. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out everything else. I turned to leave, my brain urging me to escape, to leave this place behind forever. But something glinted on the floor, catching my eye, a small pile of toys, half buried in dust. An old doll missing an eye, a broken wooden truck, a tiny, tarnished bracelet. They lay there, abandoned, each one bearing a thin layer of grime that looked as though it had settled over years. I couldn't help myself. I leaned down, fingers hovering over the doll's cracked porcelain face. And that's when I saw it. Another tally mark, right there beside the pile, so fresh that a faint trace of plaster dust still clung to the scratch marks. The realization hit me with a sickening force. I wasn't alone. Someone had been down here, recently. The whispers, the muffled voices, I hadn't been imagining them. My entire body was seized by a sudden, unyielding terror, a primal instinct screaming at me to get out before I found out who or what might be down there with me. My hands shook as I scrambled back up the staircase, my flashlight jerking wildly with each panicked movement. Every step creaked louder, echoing through the tight space, but I didn't dare look back. I could feel something, a presence, maybe a pair of eyes, watching me from the dark corners of that hidden room, tracking my every move. As I reached the top and slammed the door shut, I bolted it shut and backed away, my mind racing with images of what I'd seen. Even now, as I write this, I can't shake the feeling that I made a mistake opening that door, that I've somehow disturbed something that was meant to stay hidden, undisturbed in the forgotten shadows of my own home. The tally marks flashed behind my closed eyes, haunting me in every quiet moment. It started with a single message, a text from an unknown number, but the name displayed was mine. I read it over and over, wondering if it was some bizarre scam or a prank. But there it was, clear as day. "Hi, this is you. Just thought I'd say hello." I laughed it off, blocked the number, and shrugged it away, thinking it was nothing more than a fleeting, strange encounter with digital spam. Then, a day later, I was locked out of my email. I tried to reset my password, but nothing worked. One by one, my accounts began slipping out of my grasp. My bank app, social media profiles, even my phone passcode reset. I sat there, helpless, staring at my phone as notification after notification popped up, each one telling me an account was no longer accessible. A strange sense of dread prickled at the back of my neck, like the feeling of realizing a shadow has been trailing just outside your vision. The nightmare escalated when friends began messaging me, asking why I deleted our chats, why I hadn't shown up at a gathering I was apparently at. I received a photo from one friend who said, "Are you playing some kind of game?" It was a blurry shot taken from across a room, a party I hadn't attended, with someone dressed in my clothes, laughing with my familiar expressions, my gestures, everything. But it wasn't me. A shiver traced down my spine, icy and paralyzing, as I stared at that image, trying to find some sign, any proof that it was a hoax. The messages from friends continued to pile up, each one more alarming than the last. People told me how strange I'd seemed, how quiet I'd been, how I didn't respond to their questions but had smiled and nodded, as if enjoying some private joke. I tried to reassure myself, to hold on to some sliver of sanity. Maybe someone had hired an impersonator, maybe it was some cruel joke. But the words and the messages, the personal details only I could have known, ate at me, each revelation cutting deeper. How could anyone else know the exact shade of blue I wore to my first job interview? Or remember the scar on my wrist from that summer when I'd fallen off my bike? Desperate, I called every friend who had seen this imposter, demanding answers. The replies were all the same, vague and evasive, as if they doubted my sanity, saying things like, "You were just here last night. We talked, remember?" Each conversation seemed to solidify this sickening idea that there was something out there copying me in ways I couldn't explain. I decided to confront it, to look for this thing that was pretending to be me. I thought maybe, if I looked hard enough, I'd find some clue, some piece of evidence to unravel this surreal nightmare. I scoured my social media, scrolled through endless posts and tagged photos, looking for anything that felt wrong, something out of place. And then in the middle of the search, I found it. A video had been posted from my account, the timestamp from only a few hours earlier. I clicked, hands shaking, dreading what I would see. The video was shot in my living room, my very own living room. The familiar details of my cluttered coffee table, the soft yellow glow of the lamp, even the old stain on the corner of the carpet from a spilled cup of tea. But the person on the screen, though they looked exactly like me, felt wrong. They moved with a strange, calculated grace, their eyes too focused, too still. They looked directly at the camera, holding my gaze through the screen, and smiled. A hollow, empty smile that sent a jolt of panic through me, as if every ounce of warmth, every familiar touch, had been drained from that expression. The video ended with a slow, deliberate zoom into my face. No, into their face, until all I could see was that blank, unsettling gaze staring right at me. My heart hammered as if it were trying to escape my chest, beating against my ribs in frantic panic. I stared at my own reflection on the screen, feeling as if I'd been stripped of something essential, something that made me me. Moments after I closed the video, my phone buzzed. It was another text from that number, a simple line, "We're almost done here." It's been a week since then, and no one believes me. Friends now avoid me, messages go unanswered, and every time I check my social media, there's a new post and new message. I've stopped answering the door because more than once I've heard a familiar knock, one that sounds like my own. Each night, I wake up, half convinced I hear someone breathing in the next room, as if they're waiting, watching, biding their time. I've all but given up trying to reclaim what was once mine, because now, when I look in the mirror, I don't even recognize myself. I found the old subway ticket by accident, tucked between the seats of my car one evening after work. It was faded, worn thin with age, the ink almost rubbed away. I squinted at it, holding it up to the dim light above my dashboard, trying to make out the date stamped on it. 6 years ago. A strange chill ran through me as I tried to remember what I'd been doing that day, what subway ride I'd taken. I came up blank. I should have tossed it, but something about that ticket gnawed at me. Over the next few days, it appeared everywhere. On my desk at home, in my coat pocket, on my dresser, even taped to the bathroom mirror once. Each time, I'd throw it away, but it kept coming back like some relic that refused to be forgotten. The feeling grew into a subtle dread, a gnawing anxiety that seemed ridiculous but grew heavier each time I saw it. One evening, after I'd shoved the ticket in the trash for what felt like the 100th time, I felt a strange pull, a curiosity I couldn't shake. The subway line was still in service, just a few blocks from my apartment. A normal ride, familiar enough to be mundane, except I'd never actually used that line. The subway station was nearly deserted, silent, but for the occasional echo of a footstep down the tiled corridors. The stale smell of dust and oil hung in the air, and each step felt heavier as I descended the stairs, my hands clenched tight around that faded ticket. It was as though the entire station were holding its breath, waiting. When I reached the platform, the train was already there, idling, its lights dimmed in a way that felt wrong. I hesitated before stepping inside, a shiver running down my spine. The car was empty, silent as a tomb. The hum of the fluorescent lights above was barely a whisper, and I felt a prickling sensation, as though something unseen were watching me from the shadows at the far end of the car. As soon as the doors hissed shut, the train lurched forward. I tried to steady myself, gripping the cool metal of the handrail, but something was different about this ride. We passed through stations without stopping, each platform more deserted and dim than the last. The city outside faded, the lights in the tunnels replaced by a suffocating darkness that pressed in on all sides. I tried to tell myself it was just an old train running on some unusual route, but my stomach churned with unease. A growing sense of isolation weighed on me, like the walls of the car were closing in, squeezing out every trace of normality. The windows were pitch black now, reflecting nothing but my own pale, drawn face staring back at me. Then I noticed them. The seats, once empty, were slowly filling, passengers appearing one by one. So quietly, I barely registered it at first. A man in a shabby coat, head down, mumbling something I couldn't make out. A woman in a faded dress, hands folded primly on her lap, her face turned away. A few seats down, a figure slumped forward, obscured by shadows, their form almost lifeless. Each figure seemed to be trapped in some unyielding silence, never moving, never glancing my way. The air grew thick with tension, a suffocating dread that tightened around my chest. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, and the thought struck me, clear and sharp. They hadn't been here when I boarded. I scanned the faces, every instinct screaming at me to get off, to break the stillness that felt like it was swallowing me whole. But the train kept speeding forward, an endless journey into darkness. Then in one single moment of horrible clarity, I saw it. The figure sitting directly across from me had my face. My clothes, my posture, down to the way I held my hands tightly in my lap. My own hollow eyes stared back at me, the expression blank, drained, like a reflection of something that no longer lived. Panic clawed at my throat, an ice-cold fear that rooted me to the spot, trapping me under the gaze of this silent, dead-eyed mimic. It looked almost alive, like a shell waiting for something to animate it, to give it purpose. Every beat of my heart felt louder, heavier, my breath shallow and desperate. But the reflection didn't respond. It just sat there, mirroring my movements, the slightest hint of a smirk tugging at the corner of its mouth. I stumbled to my feet, gripping the pole for support as the car jolted, my gaze never leaving the face that was and wasn't my own. I forced myself to move, reaching for the door, yanking it open to the next car, desperate to put distance between me and that empty shell of myself. But as I stumbled into the next car, there was the same mimic seated calmly, waiting. Every car I fled to, it was there, always a few seats away, always watching. By the time the train finally slowed, I was drenched in cold sweat, my hands shaking as I staggered to the platform. I forced myself to look back only once, catching a glimpse of the figure still seated inside, staring through the windows with those empty, mocking eyes. Even now, every time I board the subway, I see my face reflected in the glass, and I can't shake the feeling that it's waiting for me, just a few cars away, its expression a hollow echo of my own. After she passed, my grandmother left me a few things, some photos, a knit blanket, and a vintage music box. It was a strange old-fashioned thing, heavy in my hand and cold with a faint, metallic scent, its edges dulled by time. I'd never seen it open. It had always just been there, a part of her dresser's quiet landscape of knickknacks. But as I stood there with it now, the silence around me settling in, I decided to give it a try. I turned the small silver key, watching it catch with a low hum, and let it go. The music began with a faint, discordant chime, the tune off kilter, wobbling on unfamiliar notes as it spun. It stopped almost as soon as it had started, a few strange tones before it died abruptly, leaving a heavy silence in its place. It was broken. Disappointed, I set it aside, thinking that I might have it fixed one day, though in the back of my mind I knew I probably wouldn't. That night, as I lay in bed, the tune drifted through my room again, faint and distant. It came from somewhere in the house, the same few warped notes, stumbling over themselves and trailing off into the dark. My heart jolted as I sat up, my breath frozen in my throat. I could still feel the weight of the music box on my dresser, unmoved from where I'd left it, but the tune was unmistakable. I told myself it must have been my imagination, a tired mind conjuring familiar sounds to fill the quiet. But the melody was so distinct, so strangely unsettling that sleep wouldn't come. I lay there, staring at the shadows on my ceiling, waiting. For the next few nights, the sound returned, always the same few discordant notes, always drifting from somewhere in the distance. Each time, the tune would stop just as I strained to catch more than a few moments of it, the silence that followed even more unnerving than the music itself. The tune seemed to linger in the air afterward, haunting me in the quiet, filling my chest with a weight that made it hard to breathe. One evening, as I sat reading on the couch, the music started again, this time from a different room, closer and more vivid, as if the sound had crept toward me, unseen. I felt my skin prickle, a crawling sensation that told me something was terribly wrong. I put the book down and listened, my pulse loud in my ears. The same broken melody, twisting and warping in those strange, fractured notes, continued from the shadows of the hallway. A deep, pervasive chill settled over me, as though the warmth had been sucked from the room. I sat there, too afraid to move, while the music faded once more, leaving me alone with a silence that felt oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The next morning, I decided to get rid of the music box. I couldn't keep living like this, waiting for that sound to taunt me each night, slowly gnawing away at my sanity. I wrapped it in an old cloth, determined to put it away, maybe bury it at the back of the closet where it could no longer reach me. As I turned to place it on the highest shelf, the music played again, a single, mocking chime, though I hadn't wound it. My hands shook as I dropped it back onto the dresser, staring at it, feeling trapped by its cold, gleaming surface. The melody played on, each note hauntingly familiar, but laced with a chilling edge, as if it had been warped to disturb rather than comfort. I backed away, my legs weak beneath me, the music growing louder, filling the room until it felt like I could barely breathe. That night, I heard the music again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the music box. The sound drifted from the walls, the corners, the dark spaces in between where I couldn't see. It was everywhere, inescapable, filling the house with its relentless, twisted tune, each note tightening around me like a vice. I lay in bed, paralyzed by fear, unable to turn away from the darkness pressing in around me, unable to escape the echo of that melody. Finally, I couldn't stand it. I leapt out of bed, flinging the closet open, grabbing the music box with both hands. I didn't care about the noise as I ran out of the house, stumbling down the street, feeling the weight of it grow heavier with every step. I kept running, barely aware of where I was going, just desperate to put distance between me and that maddening sound. I left it in a ditch, threw it as far as I could, and ran back without looking. Even now, though, the tune haunts me. I hear it in the faintest sounds, in the hum of the fridge, in the groan of the pipes. It's there in the silence, waiting, just out of reach, lurking in the spaces between every thought, a whisper of discordant notes reminding me that some things cannot be escaped. It started with a single video on my computer. I found it late one night after work, an unlabeled file sitting on my desktop. Confused, I opened it. The clip was short, less than a minute, but as soon as it started, My stomach tightened with a creeping sense of unease. The video showed my living room, empty and still, in grainy black and white. I recognized the couch, the lamp in the corner, even the magazine I'd tossed on the coffee table. But I hadn't recorded this. No one else had access to my apartment, and I hadn't installed any cameras. The file was inexplicable, and yet there was a record of my own home, as if someone had been there watching. I tried to brush it off, to forget about it, convincing myself that maybe I'd somehow filmed it without remembering, though I knew that didn't make sense. A strange, sour feeling lingered in my chest as I clicked delete. Yet, over the next few days, more videos appeared, each one slightly longer, each one somehow more unsettling. They showed different rooms of my apartment, my bedroom, my kitchen, even the small, dim hallway. The perspective was always fixed, stationary, as if a camera had been mounted somewhere high, catching everything in its silent, unblinking gaze. I could feel my nerves unraveling, fraying with each click of the mouse. Every time I opened a new video, I half expected to see someone standing there, watching the camera, watching me. But they were always empty, just a quiet record of my rooms, sitting still and silent, caught in some strange, haunting surveillance. One night, as I lay in bed, trying to quiet the flood of paranoid thoughts, I heard a faint beep from my computer. The sound was barely audible, a single, soft chime that I could have easily ignored. But something about it set me on edge, and I found myself getting up, my skin prickling with a cold, crawling fear as I approached the screen. Another video had appeared. This time, I hesitated before opening it. My hand hovered over the mouse, my chest tightening as a wave of dread washed over me. I told myself it was just another empty room, just another pointless recording, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this one was different. I clicked it, the screen flickering to life with a view of my bedroom. But unlike the others, this video wasn't empty. A figure sat on the edge of my bed, their back to the camera, their head tilted slightly as though listening for something. The figure looked familiar. The posture, the hair, even the shape of the shoulders. It took a second for the realization to hit me. The figure was me. I stared frozen as the video played on. My double sat there, motionless, as if waiting for something. Then, slowly, almost too slowly to notice, she turned, glancing over her shoulder, her eyes finding the camera. Her gaze was hollow, her expression blank, her mouth twisting into the slightest hint of a smile. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing through the silence as I watched myself, this twisted, empty version of me, staring straight at the screen. I slammed the laptop shut, my hands trembling. The image of that face was burned into my mind, the emptiness of her eyes, the faint, mocking smile, as if she knew something I didn't. I felt sick, as if some part of myself had been stripped away, exposed to the eyes of something that didn't belong. I'd barely slept that night, the dark corners of my apartment pressing in on me, every shadow twisting into that familiar figure, her blank gaze haunting me. The next morning, I tried to erase the videos, to delete every trace of them from my computer. But they kept returning, each one showing me, each one a silent performance of some new, distorted part of my life. There I was in the kitchen, sitting alone at the table, my face blank and emotionless, staring at nothing. In another, I was lying on the couch, my head tilted toward the camera, eyes wide and unblinking. It was as if these videos were mapping out my life, replacing my reality with something warped and wrong. Each file a record of something I hadn't done, each frame filling my apartment with a presence that wasn't my own. I unplugged my computer, shoved it in a closet, and tried to forget, but the feeling lingered. The sense that I was being watched, that every movement was documented, save somewhere beyond my control. Sometimes, I'd catch a flicker in the corner of my eye, a shadow shifting where it shouldn't, and I'd find myself holding my breath, half expecting to see her again, watching me from some hidden place. Now, even without the videos, I can't shake the feeling that she's still there, that some hollow reflection of myself lingers just out of sight. I see her sometimes, in the mirror or the reflection of a darkened window, that familiar, empty face staring back at me, her eyes filled with a knowledge I'll never understand. I didn't notice it at first. A small detail in the glass of my bathroom mirror, barely worth a second glance, a faint smudge on the surface. But after a few days, it became impossible to ignore. The smudge seemed to move, subtly shifting its place, as though it had a mind of its own. I'd clean it every morning, wiping it away with a towel or glass cleaner. But each time I looked back, it was still there, a faint, blurred patch that I couldn't seem to erase. Then came the small changes. One morning, I caught my reflection lingering just a moment too long, as if I'd blinked and missed it, as if I'd moved but it hadn't. A chill prickled along my spine, an unsettling sensation that made the room feel smaller, more oppressive. I brushed it off, blaming my tired eyes and the dim bathroom lighting. But the feeling stayed with me, a weight that grew heavier each time I faced the mirror. It wasn't long before my reflection began behaving in ways I couldn't rationalize. I'd catch glimpses of it frowning when my face was neutral, my reflection's mouth twitching into a faint sneer as if mocking me. Every small movement became a guessing game. Was it me, or was it my reflection deciding for itself? One evening, as I washed my hands, I looked up and saw it clearly. My reflection was watching me, its head tilted slightly, the expression cold and unfamiliar, as if sizing me up. The air around me thickened, every nerve in my body screaming to look away, but I couldn't move. I felt like a trapped animal, ensnared by my own reflection. It was as if some other presence had settled into the familiar lines of my face, studying me, dissecting me. Over time, I noticed patterns. When I felt tired, run down, the reflection's movements grew more assertive, the differences starker. It would blink too late, hold my gaze for just a beat too long, each small abnormality gnawing at my nerves, unraveling me bit by bit. The worst was when it began mimicking my emotions, only wrong, twisted. I'd smile, and it would smirk, a look of pure malice, as if enjoying some private joke. Every time I faced the mirror, it felt like stepping into a trap, as if the very act of looking gave it power. Each encounter with my reflection wore me down, stripping away my sense of self until I couldn't tell if I was imagining it, or if there was truly something there, something hollow and dark, lurking behind my own eyes. One morning, after a particularly restless night, I stared into the mirror, searching for any hint of familiarity. My reflection stood still, eyes locked on mine, a half-smile playing on its lips. I watched, horrified, as it slowly raised a finger to its mouth in a quiet shush, a twisted imitation of secrecy. The gesture was deliberate, almost intimate, like a promise. A wave of nausea hit me, a visceral, clawing fear that wrapped around my chest, making it hard to breathe. I stumbled back, gripping the edge of the sink to steady myself, my heart racing. But the reflection remained, unmoving, its expression dark and gleeful. I left the bathroom without a second glance, afraid that one more look would break something inside me. Over the next few days, I avoided mirrors as much as I could, brushing my teeth in the dark, glancing away whenever I passed a reflective surface. But reflections are everywhere: windows, phone screens, even the glossy surface of my kitchen appliances. Each flicker of my own image, no matter how brief, filled me with dread. And then one night, I woke up to the sensation of being watched, that primal awareness that something was wrong. The room was dark, shadows pooling in every corner. Yet I could sense it, the weight of a gaze, heavy and unwavering. I didn't want to look, but some terrible, morbid compulsion forced my eyes open, and I found myself staring straight into the mirror on my bedroom wall. There it was, standing at the edge of the glass, my reflection, watching me with that same twisted smile, its face half shrouded in shadow. My skin prickled, a chill sweeping through me as it moved, slowly, deliberately, leaning closer until it seemed inches away, as though it were trying to step through, to cross into my world. I shut my eyes, holding my breath, hoping it was some waking nightmare, that if I just lay still, it would fade. But I could feel it, could sense its presence lingering just beyond the glass, as though waiting for me to look again, to acknowledge it, to let it in. Since that night, I've covered every mirror in my apartment. The feeling hasn't gone away. If anything, it's grown stronger, each day pressing down on me like a weight. I feel it wherever I go, lurking just beyond my vision, watching, waiting, a dark shadow in my peripheral, the sensation of cold eyes tracking my every move. I've tried to convince myself that it's all in my head, that there's no such thing as a reflection with a mind of its own. But every so often, in those fleeting, haunted moments, I catch a glimpse, a shadowed face, just beyond the edge of the glass, and the unmistakable sensation of something holding its breath, biding its time, waiting for the perfect moment to step out and make itself known. It was late when I left the office, far past the usual quitting time, the building quiet and still as I walked down the empty corridors to the elevator. The hallway lights flickered as I passed, casting strange, stretching shadows on the walls, but I ignored it, too tired to care. All I wanted was to get home, to escape the eerie silence that seemed to press in on all sides. When I reached the elevator, the button lit up under my touch, and I watched the floor numbers count down in silence. Finally, the door slid open, revealing an empty car, its dull fluorescent lights casting a pale, sterile glow. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the ground floor, and leaned back against the wall, closing my eyes for a moment as the doors closed with a soft hiss. The descent began smoothly, the hum of the machinery steady and reassuring. But as the elevator passed the 4th floor, it slowed, then stopped. My eyes snapped open, and I frowned, glancing at the buttons. There was no light, no indication that anyone had pressed a button on another floor, and yet here I was halted mid-journey. I pressed the button for the ground floor again, hoping it was just a minor glitch. The door slid open to reveal a hallway, but it was nothing like the floors I knew. The light was dim, and the walls seemed off, like they were painted with a murky, yellowish hue that made the air feel thick and stagnant. The hallway stretched out before me, leading into shadows that seemed darker than they should have been, swallowing up the faint light. A chill settled over me, crawling up my spine, and my pulse quickened as I stood frozen in the doorway, staring into the unfamiliar space. I quickly jabbed the close doors button, desperate to get out of there, to get back to the safety of the ground floor. The door slid shut, sealing me back inside the small, enclosed space, and I exhaled in relief. But as the elevator continued its descent, the air grew heavy, almost oppressive. I watched the floor numbers blink down again, willing the car to reach the lobby without another incident. But it happened again, this time on the 2nd floor. The elevator slowed, stopped, and the doors opened, revealing yet another strange, unfamiliar hallway. This one was empty, its walls lined with abandoned, dust-covered office furniture, chairs overturned and desks piled haphazardly against the walls. The silence felt alive, pressing in on me, and the dim light flickered, casting distorted shadows that seemed to shift and move in the corners of my vision. I could feel my heartbeat quicken, my palms slick with sweat. I slammed the close doors button again, desperately avoiding any step toward that dark, foreboding corridor. As the doors slid shut, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shape shadowy and indistinct, lurking at the end of the hallway. I held my breath, praying the doors would close faster, that I could escape whatever presence lingered just beyond my sight. The elevator resumed its descent, the hum of the machinery strained and almost broken. The numbers on the panel flickered, shifting in and out, as though the car itself had forgotten its way. I felt trapped, claustrophobic, the walls closing in tighter with each passing second. The familiar structure of my office building seemed to melt away, replaced by this twisted, surreal version of itself, each floor descending into deeper, darker shades of neglect. Just as I thought I might be nearing the ground floor, the elevator stopped again. This time, there was no number on the panel, no indication of where I was. The door slid open with a shuddering groan, revealing a scene that made my skin crawl. The hallway stretched endlessly, lined with strange, discarded objects, a single, dusty chair, a mirror leaning crookedly against the wall, an empty picture frame hung askew. Each item was coated in a layer of dust and grime, as if abandoned long ago. I stepped forward, compelled by some dark curiosity, and immediately regretted it. The air in the hallway was stifling, thick with a heavy silence that settled like a weight on my chest, and my footsteps echoed in the emptiness, swallowed by the shadows. I turned to go back, to press the button and escape, but as I looked over my shoulder, I saw the elevator doors slowly closing, the car descending without me. Panic seized me, rooting me in place. I watched the elevator disappear into darkness, leaving me stranded in this eerie, forgotten level of the building. I walked down the hallway, the sound of my own footsteps the only noise in that suffocating silence, each step heavier than the last. Every corner I turned only led me to another identical hallway, each more dismal than the one before, the walls pressing in closer, the lights dimmer. I tried to retrace my steps, but nothing made sense. Every turn brought me somewhere new, somewhere darker. A deep, bone-chilling dread settled over me as I realized I might never find my way out. I stopped listening, straining for any sound, but the silence was absolute, a quiet so thick it felt like it would swallow me whole. In the end, I began to run, moving blindly down hallway after hallway, the echoes of my footsteps chasing me, the walls seeming to close in tighter, each corridor stretching longer, the dim lights flickering as if they, too, were losing hope. I don't know how long I ran, how many times I tried to find a way out. All I know is that I'm still here, wandering through these empty corridors, each one more unfamiliar, more silent. And with every step, I feel the weight of something unseen watching, waiting, as I drift deeper into this endless, abandoned descent. After repainting the living room walls, I stepped back to admire my work, feeling an odd sense of accomplishment. The room looked brighter, fresher, like a layer of the house's past had been stripped away. I hadn't noticed anything unusual about the paint job until a few days later, when a faint shape started to bleed through the fresh coat, just barely visible under the right light. It was a number small but unmistakable. At first, I thought it was just an imperfection in the wall, a spot where the paint hadn't adhered fully, so I ignored it. But the next day, the number was clearer, standing out against the pale wall. It was an 8. The sight of it stirred something uneasy within me, though I couldn't explain why. I tried painting over it, layering the area with a fresh brushstroke, erasing it for good. Yet, by the following morning, it was there again, darker than before. A strange, unsettled feeling crept through me as I stared at that stubborn number, wondering if it had been there all along or if I was just imagining things. As the days passed, the number began to change. Each morning, I'd wake to find it one digit lower. 8 became 7, then 6, slowly counting down without any reason. I scrubbed at the spot until my fingers were raw, applied coat after coat of paint, anything to make it disappear. But every morning, the number was back, looming, inching its way toward 0. The sense of dread built in my chest, a growing weight I couldn't shake, as if I were watching a timer, inching toward an unknown and inevitable end. One evening, as I was about to head to bed, I noticed the number had shifted again. It now read 4. A chill ran down my spine, and for the first time, I felt truly afraid. What was I counting down to? And why was it happening here in my own house? The quiet of the night felt oppressive, pressing in on me as I stared at the wall, the ominous number seeming to grow larger, sharper, as if it were daring me to look away. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in bed, my mind looping through irrational fears, images of that number flickering in the darkness. Every creak of the house, every shift in the air felt magnified, each sound reminding me of the countdown, ticking away while I lay helpless. The silence grew thick, tangible, filling my room with an almost suffocating weight. I could feel it pressing down on me, the knowledge of that number lurking just beyond my door waiting. By the time I gathered the courage to look again, the countdown had reached 2. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea through me, my pulse pounding as I considered what would happen when it reached 0. My thoughts spiraled, twisting into dark corners, and a terrible realization settled over me. I had no control over this, no way of stopping it. Whatever was happening was inevitable, creeping forward despite my every attempt to ignore it, to erase it. I avoided the living room for the rest of the day, doing anything I could to keep busy, to distract myself from the ominous number. But every moment felt heavy, as though the house itself were waiting, holding its breath along with me. The hours dragged on, each one ticking by with a growing sense of dread, until I could no longer avoid it. Just before midnight, I forced myself to look at the wall one last time. The number was 1. The room felt colder than before, a chill settling deep into my bones as I stood there, staring at the single digit that felt more like a threat than a countdown. I tried to tell myself it was just some trick of the mind, a harmless stain or an old imprint bleeding through the paint. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I could feel it, a dark, unseen presence looming just beyond my understanding, inching closer with every passing second. When I went to bed that night, I left all the lights on, hoping the brightness would banish the shadows that seemed to cling to every corner. But sleep didn't come. I lay awake, heart racing, waiting for some unknown event, something I couldn't name but felt creeping ever closer. At 3 a.m., a soft knock echoed from the living room, shattering the silence. My blood turned cold, fear rooting me to the spot, as the sound echoed through the dark. Another knock followed, deliberate, patient, like someone or something was waiting just outside the door. I didn't move, barely breathing, listening as the knocks continued, each one steady, measured, counting down in perfect sync with the fear pulsing through my veins. It was as though the house itself had come alive, every shadow, every creak pressing down on me, amplifying the terror that filled the room. The knocks grew louder, insistent, and I gripped the sheets, knowing that whatever was on the other side had come for me. By morning, the number had vanished from the wall, leaving only a faint trace in the paint, barely visible. But the feeling hasn't left me. Every time I look at that wall, I feel the lingering trace of something unfinished, an unbroken promise, a silent countdown that ended but left a piece of itself behind, waiting. As a taxi driver, you see all kinds of people, but there was one passenger I could never forget. I first picked him up late one night on a deserted street. He appeared suddenly, almost out of nowhere, stepping into my headlights with an unsteady gait, his face shadowed. He wore an old coat, and his hair was messy, his face bruised and pale. Something in his hollow stare put me on edge, but I ignored it, told myself he was just another late-night straggler. When he climbed into the back seat, he didn't speak, didn't meet my eyes in the mirror. Instead, he simply pointed a shaking finger toward the street, as if I should know where to go. I waited, hoping he'd tell me his destination, but he just kept staring out the window. So, without any other choice, I started driving, sticking to main roads, glancing back occasionally, hoping he'd eventually say something. But he remained silent, his face hidden in the shadows, his eyes unfocused. As I drove, an unsettling sense of dread crept over me. The silence was thick, oppressive, and every time I caught a glimpse of him in the mirror, he looked even more battered, as though the bruises on his face had darkened, his skin grown paler. His gaze was fixed on the passing streets, his expression locked in something between pain and numbness, as if he were haunted by something only he could see. The ride ended without incident, and he slipped out of the car without a word, vanishing into the night. I tried to shake it off, but that eerie silence stayed with me. It was as if his presence had left a mark in the car, a lingering unease that refused to fade. Over the next week, he appeared 3 more times, always late at night, always on some quiet, empty street. Each time he was worse, bruises darker, eyes hollow, his coat dirtier and torn. He'd climb into the back seat, point ahead, and we'd drive in that awful silence, me glancing nervously in the mirror, him staring ahead, lost in some endless darkness. On the 4th ride, I couldn't ignore it any longer. As I glanced into the mirror, something strange happened. For a brief moment, I saw myself in him. like his face had morphed into a shadowy reflection of my own. A jolt of terror ran through me, cold and sharp. I shook my head, blinked, but when I looked again, it was him, his battered face now twisted into a slight, knowing smile. That night, after dropping him off, I drove home in silence, my mind racing. Something about this passenger felt wrong, as though he wasn't just a stranger in need of a ride. It was as if he were a dark omen, something that had attached itself to me, slipping into my life with each ride, each silent, unsettling journey. I started noticing changes in myself too. Exhaustion that wouldn't lift, a deepening weariness that clung to me like a shadow, pulling me down. A week went by without seeing him, and I almost began to believe he'd disappeared for good. But one night, as I pulled up to an empty curb, he was there waiting. This time, his face was almost unrecognizable, the bruises deep and sickly, his skin pale as death, and his eyes, they looked just like mine. He climbed into the back seat, but instead of looking out the window, he stared directly into the rearview mirror, his gaze locking with mine. I couldn't look away. A suffocating fear wrapped around me, an instinctual, primal dread that told me to run, to get away, but I was rooted to the spot. The silence was unbearable, and in that moment, I felt as though I were staring into my own future, a broken, hollow version of myself, a shadow I couldn't escape. He reached up, touched his bruised face, and then pointed, his finger trembling, indicating I should drive. The fear settled into something deeper, heavier, as I pulled away from the curb, following his silent directions through streets I didn't recognize. We drove into an area of the city I'd never seen, roads winding, narrowing, until there was nothing but darkness around us. At last, he motioned for me to stop. We were in an alley, surrounded by old, crumbling buildings. I looked back at him, hoping he'd explain, say something, anything to break the tension. But he just stared at me, his face contorted into a look of grim satisfaction. I felt a chill down my spine, an unbearable sense of finality, as if I were teetering on the edge of something I couldn't understand. He leaned forward, his face mere inches from mine, and for a moment, we were the same, reflections staring back at each other in the dark. And then, he slipped out of the car, disappearing into the shadows without a sound. I sat there, frozen, unable to shake the feeling that something essential had been taken from me, something I could never get back. Since that night, I see his face in my mirror every time I drive, a pale, haunting echo that watches me, a shadow that whispers, reminding me that he is still there, waiting, as though he's become a part of me, and I'm the passenger now, forever driving into the dark. Living alone, I'd gotten used to the creaks and groans of my house, the way the old pipes would settle in the dead of night, the distant hum of the fridge. But this was different. It started with faint sounds that seemed to come from nowhere, whispers brushing through the walls, like someone muttering just out of earshot. A prickling unease stirred in my chest as the whispers grew louder, each night bringing them closer, as if they were pressing in from somewhere deep within the house. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, maybe even an effect of the silence I'd grown too accustomed to. But after a few nights, the whispers changed. They sounded familiar. The tones, the rhythm, it was like listening to a voice I knew, yet couldn't place. I'd lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling, straining to catch any words, any hint of what was being said, but it was always just out of reach. And somehow, the more I listened, the more certain I became that the voice was my own. The realization was unsettling, to say the least. The voice in the walls wasn't just a whisper. It was me, echoing back my own thoughts, mocking them, twisting them into a murmur that I couldn't quite understand. The fear grew slowly, insidiously, a gnawing doubt that something was horribly, irreversibly wrong. One night, as I lay listening to that eerie, distorted version of myself, the whispers stopped, replaced by silence that felt even more oppressive. The house seemed to hold its breath, the darkness around me thickening. Then, just when I thought it was over, I heard it, a clear, unmistakable word, spoken in my own voice, my name. It was a whisper, soft but deliberate, and it sent a cold, sharp thrill through me. I bolted upright, scanning the room, my heart pounding. But the house was still, nothing out of place. I lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it again, that faint echo of my own voice calling my name, as if some dark, hidden part of me were trapped, trying to get out. The following night, the voice returned, louder and closer, and this time it wasn't just my name. It was snippets of thoughts, fragments of memories, things I'd only ever told myself in the silence of my mind. Private thoughts, insecurities, fears. They poured out from the walls, twisted and warped into a steady murmur that filled the room. It was as though my own mind had turned against me, each word laced with a mocking edge, as if this shadowed voice knew every weakness, every doubt. I couldn't bear it. I got out of bed, pacing the room, trying to drown out the sound by forcing my own voice over it. But the whispers only grew louder, more insistent, as if they fed off my fear, growing stronger the more I tried to resist. I clutched at my temples, feeling as if my skull might split from the pressure, from the suffocating weight of my own thoughts turned against me. Desperate, I tried to leave the house, stumbling through the hallway in the dark. But as I reached for the door, a cold, paralyzing realization settled over me. The whispers were following, as if the walls themselves were alive, shifting and bending to keep me within their grasp. Each room seemed to echo with that same voice, my voice, hissing and muttering from the corners, from the cracks in the walls, as if the house had become a labyrinth designed to trap me. I returned to my bedroom, defeated, collapsing onto the bed. The whispers circled around me, tightening like a noose. I covered my ears, but the words slipped through, filling my mind with dark, inescapable echoes of my own fears. I felt myself unraveling, my grip on reality loosening as the boundaries between myself and the voice blurred, blending until I couldn't tell where I ended and it began. Then, one night, as I sat in the dark, I saw something move in the reflection of my bedroom mirror. At first, I thought it was just my shadow, cast by the faint glow of the streetlight outside. But as I stared, the shape shifted, standing still as I moved, its form slightly wrong, twisted in a way that made my skin crawl. My breath caught in my throat, a primal, instinctual fear surging as I realized that the reflection wasn't mimicking me. It was watching me, its gaze locked on mine with a dark, unnerving intensity. I stood, approaching the mirror, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the closer I got, the clearer it became. The figure was me, yet not me. It was the source of the whispers, the shadowed, fractured part of myself that had come to life within the walls of my own home. Its mouth twisted into a slow, mocking smile, and as I stood there, paralyzed, it raised a single finger to its lips, signaling for silence. I backed away, unable to tear my eyes from the reflection, my heart hammering as the whispering voice filled the room once again, louder now, suffocating, as if it were pressing against my ears from all directions. It murmured secrets, thoughts I'd never voiced, fears I'd buried deep, all laid bare in that cold, relentless tone. Since that night, the voice hasn't stopped. It follows me, filling every room with my own thoughts, my own fears, twisted and turned against me, unceasing. I've covered the mirrors, tried to drown it out with noise, but nothing works. The house has become a prison of my own mind, a dark echo chamber where my thoughts haunt me, a shadow of myself lurking just out of reach, forever watching, whispering, waiting. When I moved into my new apartment, I thought I'd finally found a place where I could settle, somewhere quiet where I wouldn't have to think about much more than work and getting through the week. The building was unassuming, almost too plain, and the hallways were narrow, darkened by old, flickering lights that gave it a dim, shadowed look. But I welcomed the silence, the stillness, hoping it would let me catch my breath. Then I noticed the door at the end of my hallway. I could have sworn it wasn't there when I moved in. It was narrow and oddly out of place, like it had been hastily added, painted in a dull gray that blended almost seamlessly with the walls. I assumed it led to a supply closet or a maintenance room, something easily ignored. But something about that door unsettled me. It was as though it didn't belong there. Or perhaps that I was the one who didn't belong. One night, as I was heading to my apartment after a late shift, I heard a faint creak echo from behind that door. I paused, the sound catching me off guard. The hall was empty, silent. Yet the door seemed to beckon, a thin, almost imperceptible whisper seeping from its edges. My skin prickled, the air heavy around me, and I felt the distinct sensation of being watched, though I was alone. For days, I avoided the door, trying to ignore the feeling that something lay beyond it, something pressing against the walls, waiting. Yet every time I passed, it was like the door had drawn closer, inching its way toward me, its dull gray surface darkening as though absorbing the shadows around it. One night, curiosity overpowered my better judgment. I reached out, fingertips grazing the cold surface, and before I realized what I was doing, I turned the handle. It opened with a slow, groaning creak, revealing a narrow, dimly lit hallway stretching far beyond the walls of the building, farther than it should have been able to reach. A chill washed over me as I stared into the impossibly long corridor, a feeling of dread twisting in my stomach. The hall was narrow, its walls a sickly shade of green, the paint peeling in places. A faint hum filled the air, a sound that was almost too low to hear, yet vibrated deep within my bones. I took a tentative step inside, then another, the weight of the silence pressing down as I ventured deeper, each step feeling like a decision I'd regret. The farther I walked, the more the hallway seemed to shift. The air grew colder, the walls closing in. Doors lined the corridor on either side, each one slightly ajar, dark gaps leading into empty, silent rooms. I peered into one, finding only an unlit space, the shadows thick and unmoving, like ink pooled in a forgotten corner. And though I saw nothing, I felt a presence in each room, as though every space held something watching from just beyond the reach of the light. I kept moving, fighting the urge to turn back. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, the dim lights overhead flickering in time with an unseen pulse. I couldn't tell if it was my own heartbeat or the heartbeat of the hallway itself, a steady, rhythmic thrum that urged me deeper. After what felt like an eternity, I stopped in front of a door that looked different from the rest. It was slightly larger, painted in a deep, unsettling shade of red that seemed to glisten in the faint light. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, my pulse quickening with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Inside was a room that mirrored my own apartment. Same layout, same worn carpet, even the same furniture arranged in identical positions. But everything was wrong. The colors were muted, the edges blurred, like an imitation hastily put together by someone who had only a vague idea of what my home looked like. A wave of nausea rolled over me as I stepped inside, feeling as though I'd intruded upon some twisted reflection of my life. And then I saw it. There, in the corner of the room, was a figure sitting on my couch, its back to me. It looked almost human, but its posture was too stiff, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, like it had been placed there rather than seated. I took a step closer, and it began to turn, its movements slow, deliberate, like it wanted me to see it. When it finally faced me, I froze. It had my face, but hollow, empty, its features a pale echo of my own, as if someone had sketched a rough, lifeless copy. Its eyes were vacant, a dark void that seemed to pull everything in. It smiled a slight, chilling upturn of its lips, and I felt something break inside me, a shattering realization that this thing, this twisted reflection, knew me, understood me in ways I couldn't fathom. I backed away, stumbling into the hallway, slamming the door shut. The corridor stretched on in front of me, longer than before, twisting and bending in impossible directions, as though it had grown, adapting to my fear. I ran, the sound of my footsteps echoing, the shadows pressing in from all sides. The walls seemed to close, narrowing until I could barely breathe, barely move. I stumbled back into the hallway of my apartment building, the gray door slamming shut behind me. I stood there, breathless, staring at the door, waiting for something, anything, to follow me out. But the silence was absolute. The door now just a dull, unremarkable piece of the wall. Since then, I've kept my distance, but I feel his pull every time I pass. And in my own apartment, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone, that somewhere in those twisted dark hallways, a hollow version of myself is still waiting, still watching, biding its time until I dare to open that door again. It was a little door in the wall that shouldn't have been there. I was packing up to leave my apartment, a studio on the 5th floor of a tired, old building, when I noticed it, tucked between the closet and the corner of the living room. The door was no taller than my knee, painted the same dull beige as the rest of the walls, as if it wanted to go unnoticed. But it wasn't just the size or the color. It was the fact that I'd never seen it before. A creeping unease settled over me as I stared at it, wondering how I could have missed something so strange in all the time I'd lived there. I knelt down, running my fingers along the edges. It was cool to the touch, slightly rough, like an old storage hatch in a forgotten basement. When I tried the small brass handle, it turned with ease, and the door opened with a quiet creak, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. There was no floor inside, just an empty void. I felt a faint, cold draft slip through, carrying with it a smell that I couldn't quite place. Something musty, damp, like the air of an old, locked room. The dark seemed to pull at me, inviting me to look closer, to lean in. Part of me wanted to shut it and forget I'd ever found it, but something stronger, an unsettling curiosity, kept me there, my fingers clinging to the handle. I grabbed a flashlight from my box of packing supplies and shone it inside. The light barely penetrated, illuminating a narrow, dusty tunnel that stretched downward at an impossible angle, descending into what seemed like an endless darkness. I thought about leaving it alone, about closing the door and walking away, but something about that space felt wrong, like it was meant to stay hidden. So, with a strange, unsettled feeling in my gut, I lowered myself through the opening, carefully stepping down onto the angled floor inside. The air grew colder as I moved deeper, each step taking me farther away from the familiar warmth of my apartment, the walls pressing close around me. The tunnel twisted as I went, winding through cramped spaces that forced me to crouch. Dust floated in the dim light of my flashlight, swirling in slow, ghostly spirals. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own breathing, echoing off the narrow walls. I'd gone farther than I'd intended, yet turning back felt even more daunting. It was as though the tunnel itself wanted me to go deeper, pulling me forward. After what felt like an eternity, I found myself in a small, square room, no bigger than a closet. The walls were close, painted the same dull beige as my apartment, but streaked with dark, greasy stains that seemed to shift under the light. I tried to catch my breath, but the air was thick, oppressive, filled with that same damp, musty smell that had lingered in the opening above. There was a heavy silence, an almost tangible stillness, like I'd stumbled into a space that hadn't been touched in decades. And then I saw it, a single chair placed in the center of the room. It was old, wooden, its surface scratched and worn, with the faintest outline of someone's shadow burned into the wood, like a memory left behind. A sense of wrongness washed over me, a creeping awareness that this space was not meant to be found, and certainly not meant to be entered. I turned to leave, but the narrow tunnel behind me seemed longer, the climb steeper than before. A cold sweat broke out on my skin as I realized I could barely see the faint outline of the door far above. The walls felt closer now, the air denser, pressing down with a weight that seemed to grow with each step. Panic prickled at the edges of my mind as I forced myself to keep moving, struggling upward, desperate to escape that suffocating, hidden space. Just as I neared the top, I felt a strange presence, like someone standing just behind me, watching. I glanced back, shining my flashlight down the tunnel, and for a split second, I saw something, a shadow, faint but unmistakable, standing in the center of the room, right where I had been moments before. It was turned toward me, its shape barely distinguishable, a vague outline that felt disturbingly familiar, like looking at a reflection through warped glass. The sight of it froze me in place, my heart pounding in my chest. It didn't move, didn't speak, but the sensation of being watched, of being studied, was so intense that I could barely breathe. I forced myself to turn away, climbing faster, practically dragging myself toward the door, feeling the weight of its gaze pressing into my back, like it could see through me, see every thought, every fear I'd ever had. When I finally pulled myself through the door, I slammed it shut, my hands shaking, every nerve in my body tingling with cold, electric fear. I stared at the small door, half expecting it to creak open again, to reveal that dark void and the shadow that lurked within it. But it remained closed, silent, blending back into the wall as though it had never been there. I don't know what I saw down there. I don't know if it was real or if the darkness twisted my mind, showing me something that wasn't truly there. But ever since that night, I can feel it, a presence just on the other side of that door, something waiting, watching, as though it's only a matter of time before it comes up to find me. And in the quietest hours, when the apartment is still, I can almost hear it, a faint, rhythmic tapping from behind the wall, counting down, waiting to be opened once again. Don't forget to subscribe and watch more of my videos. Thank you.